Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to The Backstage, a project of ResilientChurchLeadership.com. My name is Eddie Copeland. I'm coming at you from South Florida here at the office of the National Christian Foundation of South Florida, where I'm privileged to lead a gospel city movement called Church United, where we have just learned a lot over our years vesting in pastors' lives and marriages beneath the waterline, believing that healthy leaders lead healthy churches and healthy churches will change the fabric of our city. And that's kind of what you are joining here live with us as we just take an hour to invest in the backstage. If you're anything like my inbox this morning, it was flooded with 6 ways to grow your church, 12 new things you can learn about discipleship in the midst of the pandemic, and so on. We know that there's a lot of content that focuses us on, as pastors and ministry leaders, on the front stage. But each and every week, we take an hour to look at the backstage, things of soul care and character, really believing that investment in the backstage and emphasis on the backstage will always strengthen the front stages of our ministries. This week, you're in for a treat. We have a special guest with us here, along with our normal panelists. Our guest this week is Leith Anderson. Leith probably doesn't need an introduction. You probably know him already, but if you need one, he is the President Emeritus of the National Association of Evangelicals, and he's also the Pastor Emeritus of Wooddale Church in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, where he served for over 35 years. Leith is a respected pastor to pastors, and we are honored and thrilled to have him here as we talk about resiliency and longevity in ministry this afternoon. We're also joined by Dr. Margaret Diddams, industrial psychologist and principal at the Diddams Group and editor of the Christian Scholars Review, and my friend Dr. Eric Brown, assistant professor of counseling at DePaul University in Chicago. But before we get going, friends, like and share this on the platform of which you are viewing this on. Obviously, we want to get this message out to as many pastors and ministry leaders, because not only do we need a united church now more than ever, we need healthy leaders leading healthy churches now more than ever. So thanks for tuning in with us, and let's just jump right into our conversation this afternoon. So Leith, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. Listen, you pastored the same church for over 35 years, and your father pastored for 33 years. What have you learned over those years in pastoral ministry? And maybe just take us into that journey.
Yeah, well, thank you, Eddie. The journey, well, as you mentioned, my father was a long-term pastor of a large church, metropolitan New York City, actually in New Jersey, the suburbs of New Jersey. Went to college in Illinois and seminary in Colorado and became a youth pastor in the Front Range of Colorado. And I loved the church. I loved it for a couple of years. And I loved the senior pastor. He was a mentor. He's still a mentor, a lifelong friend. And, at the time, that's 24 years old, I figured I could spend the rest of my life in this church with this pastor. And it was great. And then one Wednesday night in a monthly church business meeting, which is about 12 too many per year, they voted me out on Wednesday night, and it was crushing. And then on Friday, I got a call from the chair of the church board. And he said the senior pastor had been unexpectedly called out of town, and at the last minute, they couldn't find anybody to preach on Sunday. And then, honestly, one of the most memorable lines of my life, he said, "And we knew you'd be free."
Well, Leith, we're going to take the next hour and just talk about this story. So let's throw everything else you want to talk about. I'm sure Dr. Brown's got something to say here.
The church was too small. It was too long ago. Things weren't recorded. I don't have the notes, but I didn't mention anything about what had happened on Wednesday night. My father had once said that pastors are supposed to love the people and teach the Bible. So that's what I tried to do. It was in May. That summer, the pastor resigned, took another job, and in July, they called me as senior pastor, and I served there for 10 years. It was an unexpected set of twists, which is often true in pastoral ministry. And after that, was called to Wooddale Church in suburban Minneapolis and was pastor there for 35 years. Twice you said more than 35 years. It was exactly 35 years to the second. I started at midnight on January 1, and I finished at midnight on December 31st.
Man, you caught me. I'm Greek, and we're tend to exaggeration on small facts. So, man, sorry. You got me. But let's talk about those 35 exact years, though. Listen, let's just jump to it. Being a pastor is pretty difficult right now. I spend a lot of our time, as do all of our panelists, day in, day out, working with pastors, working with ministry leaders. And the common thread is it's hard to be a minister right now. It's our churches are more divided than ever. Our culture is more divided than ever, whether it's masks, pandemic, racially, politically. You just can't win as a pastor, it seems, right now. And as you reflect over those 35 years, if I could just ask you, like, how many times did you consider quitting, or did you have to reevaluate? Man, like, am I really called to this? Like, how did you press through times like we're experiencing today?
Yeah, I do think it's a hard time for pastors. I think it's a hard time for a lot of people, for police officers and physicians and politicians and professors. There are just a lot of challenges in a polarized society. So I have never primarily seen my call as being a pastor. I've seen my call as being a Christian. And so what does the call of Jesus Christ in my life mean in the place where he has currently put me? So I think that was, an important and I think a significant factor in longevity. But anyway, I count the times. I don't know how many times I felt like quitting. I think they were more frequent in some of the early years than in some of the later years. And often they were tied to criticism. I wish I had learned, in a doctoral program, I took a course in conflict management. I wish I had taken that years earlier. I wish I had understood that criticism from one person in the church doesn't mean everyone in the church. It often doesn't mean the spouse of the critic. Often the spouse has a totally different view. I just didn't know that. I tended to extrapolate it over too many people. And then sometimes I think I felt like quitting, not because of criticism or failure, but because of success. So that when things went really well, I felt, I'm not sure anybody said this to me, that I thought I needed to do something else that was even better. Really good sermon, next week's got to be a better sermon. Some new program, next week has got to have a better new program. And a few times I just came to the point where I don't have any better sermons. I don't have any better programs. And I don't want to disappoint them and I don't want to fail. So yeah, it was multiple times.
Yeah. Hey, Margaret, I'd love to hear your take here as an organizational industrial psychologist. We've spoken offline about, reevaluating our calling, reevaluating the things that I'm chasing after is actually kind of a healthy practice. I would just love to hear your take and the lens through which you view that through.
Well, I thank you, Eddie. I just want to reinforce what Leith is saying about broadening the specificity of our call, as it were, having a broader call perceived. I always like to say God sometimes calls us direct, like the voice in the bush. But as we look at biblical calls, every time people get a direct call, it is nasty hard work. So we know that God calls us to missional and general calls, how we live our life, how we live out our relationships with our family and those that we are at work. And so I think broadening that sense of call gives us margins to understand what it is that we're actually called to do. So Leith, talking about your call to serve the Lord, love people, minister to them. I think part of that longevity is that flexibility, as it were, and not feeling like you were channeled right just into that perfect program or perfect sermon. And so the way I like to think about vocational discernment, I like to sail. Out here in Puget Sound, we have pretty good wind in the fall. And if you're sailing up north, you're usually sailing into the wind and tacking. And, tacking is going back and forth. And for me, that is a beautiful image of vocation, because we often, with this broader view of vocation, we find ourselves going in a direction that needs correction. And that's just sailing. That's what we do. To move forward, we have to tack. And we have a journey. It's just not as straight And I think when you talk to people seasoned as Leith, maybe I'll put you on the spot here. You look back and you go, yeah, there's a straight line there, but there was a lot of tacking, and that's reasonable to have those moments of questioning. We're going to talk more about that, but I think the key thing here is know that when you're tacking, it's normal. That's how you move forward, and having a broader view of vocational calling gives you margins.
Yeah, it's good.
Moves.
Before we move on to, you said something in our pre-call, Margaret, that actually that jumped to mind as Leith was sharing a little bit of his kind of intro and story. Is, in the earlier years of his ministry, he felt more like, man, like, the criticism piece, organizational satisfaction. The longer he went on, like, the more rooted and, I would use the word, secure he got. And you often talk about organizational satisfaction in a U shape, and I actually think that'd be helpful for you to just expound on a little bit as pastors are kind of feeling this right now.
Yeah, I thank you. I appreciate what Leith said about Bronning. This is healthcare workers. This is police officers. There's just stressors for everyone. And so you see this pattern, I call it the U shape, or we call it in my field, the U shape, is you see people when they start an organization, organizational expectations high, their own expectations of themselves high, and then 5-6 years into it, they tend to bottom out. Expectations of themselves, expectations of organizations, because remember, we're in a kingdom reaching, but not yet restored. And you get to year 5, and this fit that felt so good at the very beginning, it's got a lot of grit in it. And so you see people tend to burn out, which is really an issue of fit, or they wrestle with who am I in this organization, what are realistic expectations of me, and what are realistic expectations of this organization. Because let's face it, people tend to come in with this honeymoon view, and what happens is people have this wrestling, doesn't last that long, could be a year or so, and they either leave or they make the adjustment, and then you see satisfaction come up. And this is across industries. It's a normal aspect. And you've talked to someone who's been in an organization 10, 15 years, they will talk about that time around year 5 or year 6 that they were really struggling with staying or going, and the adjustments that they made.
That's good. So Leith, you've talked about ministries like chapters in a book, and I'd love for you to share about that. And as you do, like, just reflect back, what kept you in ministry?
Yeah, well, it was Lyle Schaller, the sort of the godfather of church consultants, also wrote 100 books, who talked about ministry as being like chapters in a book. And then when you finish one chapter, you move on to another, which is different. And then there are times when you finish a volume and you put it on the shelf and you start another one. He also said something, I want to sort of piggyback on what Margaret said. He said in the 6,000 churches that he consulted in person, he said the best years of the church tended to come in the 7th year of the senior pastor's ministry in the church. He said the difficulty is too many pastors leave in year 5 or 6. And he equated that to being a farmer who clears the field and pulls the stumps and pushes the rocks back and plants and waters and weeds and then leaves before the harvest. So I think understanding some of those timelines are helpful. So what kept me? Lots of different answers. The way I'm wired, I have a need to keep commitments. So if I start a class, I tend not to drop it. If I start writing something for a deadline, I need to finish it. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is, it's almost a little strange to say, but I had a family to support. I had 4 children. I needed a job. I needed a paycheck. I needed health.
No, that's real.
So, that would kind of get me through this crisis. And sort of the good news was this crisis was forgotten because there was a new crisis that came along, not too long after that. I think another part of it, Eddie, is seeing the blessings. I think that's important to do. And one of the things about long-term pastoral ministry, you see the couple that struggled and now they're doing really well. You see the child that was delinquent that now is growing saint. You see multiple generations. That is really a satisfying thing to do. And then, I mean, I can just keep going on with these reasons, but I kept a little note in my desk, longhand. It said, Babe Ruth struck out 1,330 times. Mm. And, if you think you're going to have a home run sermon every weekend, nobody does that. Obviously, there's going to be pitfalls, there's going to be problems, there's going to be challenges along the way. And I would add to my list of blessings a supportive church board. And my heart goes out to those who have an adversarial church board. That is extremely difficult.
Yeah, so a lot of what you shared just deeply resonates. And Eric, I would love to get your take on this, because here's what I'm hearing, at least in our context here in South Florida, is there's so much pressure that's put on pastors to deliver those home runs every Sunday, right? Like the metrics of like how many people showed up, how good was it, did it resonate? And at the end of the day, like you can only do that for so long until it just crushes your soul and disillusions you to your calling. And Eric, I'm sure you spent a lot of time talking to pastors and ministry leaders about that, but how do you respond to that? Because I am seeing pressure increase and increase and increase. The constant need to keep up with social media, likes, retweets. I got to have a platform when, well, no, you just got to pastor people. And that's messy and not always sexy, but love to hear your take.
I like that, Eddie. It is messy and not always sexy. Rarely is it. Yeah, I'll respond to that. Then I want to kick it back to Leith, because I know a little about his history, and I think he can resonate with this. What I'm finding is that pastors struggle the most when the church ministry is all they have in terms of their vocation. One thing I love about what Leith said is he recognized his first calling is to be a Christian. Right. And we can live out that vocation in various ways. And so, Eddie, just part of my own history, and then I'll talk about what I represent for other pastors. My grandfather and father both were pastors, but they were bivocational. And so that was the model that I came up with, this bivocational ministry. And I remember my father always saying, he said, the good thing about being bivocational is that when the church is unhappy with you, hopefully what's going on in your other vocation, you're able to get the support that's needed there. And I am seeing that with pastors quite often. I think that sermon, and it's coming every week, particularly in churches that aren't mega churches where you have 3 or 4 people, pastoring. You can put more weight on that weekly sermon than you should, especially if you don't have something else. And I'm not saying all pastors need to be bivocational. There's something we also call avocation, right? Having a vocation that you're not getting paid for. But even if it's something, I remember there was a stage when just about every pastor had a blog, right? And so people could feel good about what they were producing on their blog, even if things, at the church wasn't going well. And I think that's good for healthy identity. Because one of the main struggles is for pastors, our whole life is there. Our immediate family, hopefully, goes to our church. A lot of our closest friends in town, quite often are in the church. And so when church life is not going well, it really takes down everything else. But one thing about Leith's history is, Leith, you've had a number of jobs during those years when you were pastoring. I'd love to hear you speak on that.
Yeah, I have. When I was first a pastor, I had an opportunity to teach a seminary course. It was late August, and the preaching professor had a heart attack, and so did the administration, because I didn't have anybody to teach his classes. So they called me and said, well, can you do it like starting next week? So I did, and frankly, we needed the money. I remember a day a Sunday when we're driving home from church, and one of our young children said, "Can we stop at McDonald's or Burger King?" And I realized I had maybe $1 or $2, and I couldn't afford to do it. And the credit cards were, paying the minimum. And so actually teaching and getting paid for it was something that I needed. But that morphed. So there was more teaching and then a bunch of other things. And so even when eventually pastoring a large multi-staff church, I kept doing other things. And I'm joking about this, but it's like if they're upset with you in one place, they love you in another place. And then when the people that love you are mad at you, you can go back to the other one and you can switch back and forth. And especially if they're somewhat independent of each other, if they're different constituencies. And as you use the word, Eric, of avocational, it could be a hobby, it could be something completely different, but it's sort of a good version of siloing. I'm generally not a fan of siloing, but this is a type of siloing that I think is healthy and beneficial. And for me, it's been a God-given gift throughout my career.
Would you attribute? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just Leith, as you were talking, I'm thinking about one of my mentors when I was pastoring, senior pastor at a church in Florida, Stephen Puckett. He's just retired. But what Stephen did with his 1 day off a week, he actually worked for the public school system. He served as an IT guy just once a week. He would go to a school, and just psychologically, he would talk about how beneficial that was for him, just giving him a community outside of the church.
I want to add, folks, I swam master swim team competitively for starting in my 40s, and there were quite a few Christians on the team and pastors. And when you're in the water with other people don't really care what your job is. And it was just wonderful to have this time, this 1 hour every morning, a couple mornings a week, where no one knew who I was besides a backstroker and a pastor that we swam with, some other, just to have that time away where I don't have any labels on me was an incredible gift of margin.
Well, that's exactly what. Yeah.
Just before,
go ahead.
If it were dependent for me on IT or swimming, that would have been. You got to find something you can actually do.
Could find something, right?
That's good. But do you attribute those other called vocational expressions, but those other outlets to live out and work out what God had placed on your heart to do, your calling? Do you attribute having those outlets to your longevity in ministry, to the fact that you're able to sustain 35 years at the same church and find success there?
Yeah, I think it was. Among other things, it was cross-pollination. I met people that were very different than the people in the church. And I think diversity is a healthy thing, not just for churches and organizations. I think diversity is good for me as a person. And so I built relationships with people diverse in terms of religion. In some cases, people with very, very different views than my Christian faith, but also diversity in ethnicity and race and gender. And that was really good. And I think that made me a better pastor as a result.
Hey, before I ask you this next question, Leith, just want to remind our audience, if you're just joining us, we're interviewing Pastor Leith Anderson here along with our panel about longevity and resiliency in ministry. And if you have a question for us, please put that in here in Zoom or on Facebook on the platform, and we'll be sure to make some space to get to some questions here. But Leith, I'd actually love for you to speak to today's, the right now cultural moment that pastors and ministry leaders are navigating. How should pastors navigate from your perspective, or what wisdom would you offer to the many things that they're facing right now?
Yeah, that's the challenge. And I don't want to pretend that I've got the answer to that, because I'm not convinced anybody has the answer, because we have now a cross-section of political polarization and a pandemic and economic change. There are so many things that are going on now that it's different than other times. I guess there's two prongs to this. One is There are staples that are good for every circumstance. And then there is a need to understand the immediate context of what is going on. So in terms of understanding the immediate context, I think we need to be well informed. I think that our news sources need to be diverse, that we need to be interacting with different kinds of people to understand their perspective. And we need to be connected with other pastors and other churches to find out what they are doing, because some are really good at certain things, not everything. I think it's important to learn from others, but not to copy others, because often when we copy others, we end up with an inadequate duplicate that we are not able then to operate. It's got to be personalized. But as far as the things that are staples, I've spoken at lots of pastors' conferences over the years, and I found that one of the more perplexing things is when I would ask pastors in a large group to break into smaller groups and just talk about what they're good at. Mm. And I found that many of them, they couldn't do that. They could tell you what they're bad at. They couldn't tell you what they're good at. And,
why do you think that is? What do you attribute that to? Just your personal take.
Bad theology. We acknowledge that we are sinners, but we need to recognize that we're saved by grace and that we are in a process of sanctification and that God has gifted us and that we need to work with that which God has enabled us to do. Peter Drucker, the management expert, said, if you become the CEO of a company that has 5 product lines, 2 are in real trouble and 3 are doing well, and you have $15 million to invest, where are you going to put the money? And the typical answer is you put it in the 2 failing product lines. And he said, don't do that. Put the money into the 3 successful product lines, and that will raise the level of the harbor. And that is the best thing you can do for the areas of weakness. So, that means that I need to think through what am I good at? And what that comes down to is I need to know myself, what I'm good at and what I'm not, and stop trying to fix all the things I'm not good at and take advantage of the things that I am good at. And then to understand other people. I guess high on my list for all pastors is you must know the culture, you must know the context, and you must adapt to that. So risking a too long answer here, but Jesus, when we read John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And then down in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. I think J.B. Phillips said, pitched his tent in our midst. Or as one too contemporary person said, he parked his RV in our park. That's maybe going a little bit.
All depends on what part of the country.
Yeah, I guess it does. But the point here is Jesus left heaven and adapted to our language, our culture, our way of doing things. I saw something recently on television, back to the day when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. And a reporter talked to someone on the street who was grieving and said, did you know FDR? And this person said, no, I didn't know FDR, but he knew me. He knew me. And that's what we all want in a pastor. It's not just that I know the pastor. I want a pastor who knows me, who understands who I am and how I think and where I hurt. And that is such an asset in tumultuous times where people are looking for somebody who knows them and loves them and is stable and has values and teaches the scriptures.
Eric, Margaret, what do you think are some of the potholes or the roadblocks that's keeping many people in our pews from saying what Pastor Leith just said about FDR, that keep people from going, that pastor knew me?
I want to ask a little more, Leith. Leith, you had a very healthy, good-sized church in Minneapolis. And how did you find the time? How did you make it so you knew people? Because a marker of a pastor's success is often growth, but then that paradoxically comes with distancing because you don't get to engage with everyone. But you made it a important part of your ministry that you knew the people who were at your church. Can you talk a little bit of how you were able to make that a priority?
Yeah, well, Margaret, if you're a vascular surgeon, you can't say, I don't have time to go to a conference and learn more about it. If you're going to be good at what you do, you've got to relate to what is your calling and your profession. Specifically, things that I did, Charlene and I entertained in our home. Early on, we would have a couple or a couple of couples to dinner. We switched that. And we switched it so we would invite 20 people over for an evening, a game night. Sometimes in a larger church, 100 people or more than that. They're out in the yard. One time we had families over and we couldn't find two children, and they had set up a board game on top of a toilet in one of the bathrooms, and they're playing there. But the reality is that we connected with them there. But even though eventually there were a staff of people that did pastoral calling, I would still see people in the hospital. I had the standard that I had at least a day every week, which was for appointments, and anyone who wanted to meet with me, I would meet with. And you say, well, how do you do that when you've got a congregation of thousands of people? First of all, not that many people ask, number one. And number two, they might have to wait, or if someone that makes the appointments clears the way. I asked people if I could come and visit them at work. So I would go to their places of employment. In Colorado, it was much more likely to be invited to their homes. That's not as much the culture in Minnesota as it was in Colorado, but it's all of those things. But the point I'm trying to make here is it's whatever the context is in that place. If you go to Cape Cod, nobody goes in the front door. Nobody. The front doors of a lot of houses weren't even open. They always use the side door. So if you're a pastor there, or you're doing calling, go to the side door. Don't go to the front door. It's understanding their culture and adapting to them instead of making them adapt to you.
That's good. Eric, put a counselor, and you hear pastor too, but put a pastor and a counselor hat on. Yeah. Talk to us.
That's good. Leith, what I love hearing from Leith is he maintained truly that pastoral nature, not just in title, but actually being with people. And that's something I've heard and I've read over and over. Your pastoral work actually makes you a better preacher, makes you a better teacher. The only other thing I would add, and I say this when I teach counselors, and I've also have opportunities to teach pastoral counseling, as well at different institutions, is I tell people, you want to be a good consumer of the arts. I was a pastor at a multi-ethnic church, and I've been a part of a multi-ethnic church ever since. And that's really hard, when you have people who have different life experiences, in your congregation. And I love that story about FDR. I didn't know him, but he knew me. One way we can kind of learn about the experiences of others is read good literature. There's memoirs out there. You don't want to take one person's experience. So, for example, you don't want to read one Asian American author and assume everyone has that experience. But you can read 2 or 3 books in a matter of 3 or 4 years to really know the hearts of people who are experiencing what they're experiencing.
It's good.
Eddie, I have another question I'd like to ask.
Oh, please. Yeah, absolutely.
It goes to Leith. You talked about the importance of taking that conflict management class. We love in industrial organizational psychology to talk about win-win, finding the spot of agreement, finding that one place where you have commonality. And Eddie, as you're talking with pastors, and Eric, what I've heard from you in the past year is so many people coming to church and saying, this is my Rubicon, Ebenezer, whatever. If you don't agree with me, even over something like mass, we're out. So my question, Leith, is how do you, or how have you dealt in your years as pastor when people just set down their Ebenezer, as it were, and say, this is it?
Well, again, it depends on context. So I've talked to a lot of pastors about the mask issue. And I'll just give you a sampling. I have some that say you wear a mask or you don't come in. And they've lost people over that. And then there have been others that say, they don't say this, but wear a mask and you don't come in. And some pastors, particularly in rural areas, have said, this is a battle we can't fight. And so they've decided people are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to choose their own way. So I think that we need to recognize there's not a single category. There are gradations here. So in my own experience, because of longevity, when AIDS was first such a fearful threat in America, we had some people who purchased pamphlets and distributed them to the congregation that were awful. They were threatening. They were unscientific. There were all kinds of things. So I called for a Sunday evening congregational meeting. It was very well attended, spoke to it, consulted with the infectious diseases people at the Mayo Clinic here in Minnesota, so I had good authority. But shortly after that, we had twins that the parents asked if we would care for them in the nursery, and they were infected. They were positive. And we had people in the church that say, if you allow those children in the nursery with the best of care and, all the precautions, then we will not place our children in the nursery. And I decided that was one of those cases where I'm not going to bend. And I decided those children are going in the nursery. If there are no other children there, they will be the only ones there. But this is a place where we will not compromise. And it's interesting that I was really fearful of where this would go. It turned out really well. People appreciated that. They understood that we took careful precautions, but that we loved people that were in the midst of a crisis. And it worked out all right. So you've got to decide, is this one you're going to lose your job over, or is this a minor one? And hope you get it right.
That's powerful. I appreciate you sharing that. So Leith, as you look back to, we're talking about resiliency and longevity here in ministry, and as you look back, I hate to say it's formulaic, but are there been any routines or formulas that have supported that work for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I try to routinize. If I assume that I have 100 units of time or energy, I need to find as many things as I can that I just do the same way all the time. So I wake up at 5:30 in the morning. I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I don't need to set an alarm clock unless it's earlier than that. I go to the same gas station, order the same thing at the fast food. I'm not going to expend my energy there, which gives me more margin. And I think that is, a really helpful way of going about things. Learning the context, and an axiom that I shared with church staff and colleagues a lot, because I really believed in it, is that at the church, we will not reward dysfunction. And I think there's an epidemic of churches that reward dysfunction. So people behave in unchristian and inappropriate ways that they may have grown up with. They may not even realize they're dysfunctional. And they get approval because they're good donors, because their parents founded the church, whatever. And that taints and hurts everybody. So it's this constant reminder that we need to graciously and biblically avoid rewarding dysfunction. And
that's so strong.
Well, it draws healthy people to the church. And the more healthy people there are, one of the best compliments that I can ever remember was a marriage counselor here in the Twin Cities, not from the church. And they sent a couple to Wooddale Church. And I met the couple and said, how'd you come? They said, well, our marriage is in distress. And the counselor said, you need to go to a church with our healthy marriages just to see what they're like. And not that all our marriages were healthy. But I thought that's exactly what we want the church to be. We want to promote health. We do not want to reward dysfunction.
Hey, so I'd love to bring Eric and Margaret into that, because over the year that we've done this project, we have talked a lot about this systemic unhealth, spiritual abuse, disillusionment. I mean, insert your word here, that is occurring in a lot of our churches, specifically here in the West, that we value that front stage so much that we let a lot of the backstage stuff go, or we brush over it. And in that sense, we reward dysfunction. And I would love to hear, Eric, Margaret, you guys, your take on that and how that is affecting the church in the moment that we're in today.
Yeah, Margaret, if you don't mind, I just want to underline what Keith was saying. And I want to be careful in saying this because when you start a church, if you're a church planner, a lot of times, the people who first come, a lot of times they are struggling. Okay. But as a church matures, and I think it is setting those boundaries, I'm just so impressed with how Leith, and it couldn't have just been you, Leith. It had to be, the governing board and other church leaders who agreed to set these healthy boundaries. It does attract healthy people. Mature people, they're looking for that as they're going to churches. And I've been able to move to a few places now, and I've noticed there's such a thing as a healthy church, right? And healthy churches tend to attract emotionally mature people. And a lot of that is a sign, it's a result of leaders who are able to set good boundaries.
Can I just add one little piece to that?
Please.
When we moved to Minnesota, we bought our house in the wintertime, so the lawn was covered with snow. We didn't see what it looked like. And then when the snow melted in the spring, there were just weeds everywhere. The lawn was terrible. So we called up and brought in a service called ChemLawn and asked for an estimate to fix it. And we were rejected. Let's talk about humiliation. We were rejected by ChemLawn. And in the church was the regional director of the United States Department of Agriculture, a former farmer. And I said, what am I going to do? He said, just grow grass. What? He said, don't worry so much about the weeds, just grow grass. If you focus on growing the grass, eventually that'll put the weeds in a perspective that you can handle. And that's exactly what we need to do in churches. We need to grow the health. We need to accentuate the health. We need to tell stories in sermons that are healthy examples, not bleak, awful, terrible outcomes. People need hope. I've just always been convinced that people get beat up 6 days a week. They do not come to church to be beat up on a seventh day.
That's right.
They come for hope. They come for hope to get through the next 6 days of the week. And health creates hope, and hope creates health. They go together hand in hand. And that's what the church needs to be.
We just got a comment on Facebook that says that will preach. And I very much agree with that commentator. But Margaret, go ahead.
Yeah, Leith, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Is we, with an appropriate level, talk about, not going to die on every hill. This is not a hill I'm going to die on, etc. But then and this is across organizations, whether you're a pastor or, working in industry somewhere, what are the hills? What are the hills that you're willing to die on? That's part of that healthy aspect, because I think a lot of times people don't know the hills that they're willing to die on. And if they do have hills, they tend to be theological in nature, and that's appropriate. But what are the organizational hills? At what point are you willing to put your arm around someone and say, brother, sister, this is not good?
No matter who they are or what they give.
Exactly. I like to use the expression, if you're waiting for something good to happen, for something to work itself out, or it doesn't. It's not going to happen. If you have dysfunction just doesn't go away. It feeds. And so you can't just wait for something to go away or something like that. You have to address the interpersonal issues. And so I'm always interested that people are willing to speak to theological, but when it comes to interpersonal, they're just kind of hoping, that it will have its own season, and it really doesn't. I don't know, Leith, that's your experience with those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think there are different reasons why we set thresholds at different places. Sometimes it's because that is our background and our tradition. And we need to be willing to back off long enough and say, am I just talking about where I went to school? Am I just talking about a book that I read? Am I just talking about the church where I grew up? Or is this really a biblical issue? And is this really appropriate within this particular context? And the vast majority of important decisions that we make don't need to be made right now. So, I mean, they need to be made soon. They can't deliberate indefinitely. But, there's an old adage that says you shouldn't make a major decision in life when you're tired, when you're sick, when you're stressed, when you're angry, or when you're euphoric, because you will probably make a less than best decision. So it's backing off. Another part of it, I think, Margaret, is anticipating what you're going to do if a situation arises. And some people would say, I do way too much of that. I think, well, what if we do this and where will that go? I recall a situation where a woman with a baby came into the church building and was asking for assistance. No one knew her. She didn't have a place to stay. She needed money. And one of the pastors of the church met with her in his office, and he said, well, excuse me a minute, we're going to give you help. And he went down the hall to get money or whatever, and then came back, and she had gone. But the baby was still there. So she hadn't come for money. She had come to abandon her child. But we had a system in place that if a situation like that ever arose, so we immediately, from a preschool, had a licensed caretaker that took the child. We immediately had someone who was prepared to call the authorities. My job in this little task force was I was to deal with the press. So how am I going to answer that? And I don't have a lot of time, but my answer was to say to the press, it's such a sad thing when any mother ever abandons a child. But the good news is she knew that if you come to the building with a cross on the top, they'll love you there. They'll love you there. So, but it was thought through in advance. So if we can do that, that helps us not in the situation that doesn't arise. It has prepared us for the situation that we didn't expect that did arise.
Leith, can I come back in? I want to go back to one of Margaret's early questions about dying on a hill. How do you even know if you have the capital to do so? Okay. When I talk to a lot of church leaders, sometimes they struggle even recognizing, do they have the church support to fight certain battles?
Some churches are family system churches. So everybody in the church is related. And in many of these churches, you will never have the support. You might get some if you marry into the family, but it's a high price to pay for pastoral success. So the better way of looking at this is, you probably already know that I've been big about pastoral ministry being like a poker game. I wrote about that. And you have so many chips. And sometimes when you get the call to a church, they give you 1,000 chips and you can invest them. But that doesn't work if you have a 5,000 chip issue. So that means you have to borrow chips from other people. You have to go to those that have the credibility and have the resources. And it's back to what Margaret and I were talking about before, that it may take 3 or 6 years before you have an adequate resource of capital before you can make significant changes. But there are churches that have established multiple pastors of dysfunction because they have never stayed long enough to accumulate the chips to effect the change to bring about health. So that's an argument for longevity as well. By the way, I'm not saying that pastors should stay in churches. There are times when you just need to go, when you need to recognize we did what we could do and we cut the losses and we need to leave. Just don't make that decision precipitously.
That's good. In our last few minutes here, I got a question from one of our listeners that wants to go back to something that you said earlier, Leith, if we could. He's referencing your quote, when a church rewards dysfunction, you'll attract dysfunction. How would you define dysfunction?
I've got 2 people that I'm looking at on the screen who have PhDs in defining dysfunction. I just said I shouldn't answer something precipitously. So, yeah, I think that they could give a better answer to that than I could. But this is not an adequate answer. It's health. So, what does health look like? That's very difficult to define. It's very difficult to describe. But it is thinking and behaving in ways that will self-perpetuate to a whole person. It's the trajectory toward shalom. And when dysfunction goes against accomplishing that, then we need to say, how can we bend the curve in a healthy direction. And if the psychologist could fix that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah. So Margaret, Eric, I would love to hear your take on that. And as you're sharing that, Leith, if I could ask you to give an example from your 35 years where you said, we're not going to celebrate that. Like, that's dysfunctional. We're not celebrating that here. We're not going to tolerate that here. But as you think about that, Margaret, Eric, how would you do that? How would you define dysfunction?
In intensive question. So bear with me. I don't want to give such a simplistic answer, but if people are coming to church with a sense of shame that they're experiencing church that they don't experience outside of church. So is a church a shaming institution in the sense of their expectations about me? And those expectations can also be not only about me personally, but my social system. So do I feel shame because I'm a person of color? Do I feel shame because I am a woman? Do I feel shame because I might have a family that is not perfect? When I come to church, do I feel the love, mercy, and grace of God, or do I feel a sense of shame about who I am and who I bring to the church? And that's a marker of dysfunction in a church.
That's good.
That's really good. Yeah, and I would just add really simply, and I'm going to give you a biblical answer, not a clinical counseling answer, if that's
Come on, Pastor.
Right. I love when Leith said, a sense of shalom, that sense of peace. And we're not just talking about the absence of conflict here, right? But we're talking about a sense of peace that is generative, that extends to other persons as well. I always tell people, think about, the book of Galatians, right? The fruit of the Spirit. And remember that it is fruit. It is not fruits, right? This is one fruit with these different aspects to it. And a person who's able to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit, that's a healthy person. That is the opposite of dysfunction.
That's strong. We make this practical for us, for a pastor, ministry leader that's listening to this. It's a practical example as you look back and when you went, no, like there was this that was being celebrated or rewarded in your church context. We're actually not going to do that, and you shut it down or went a different direction.
I can think of examples. Confidentiality becomes a challenge when talking to you about this. And I'm going to give you an example that I could do after I'd been to church 25 or 30 years, whatever the number was. I doubt I could have done this early on. I had taken the month of July off as a study month. There was a wedding that was planned. A staff person was going to conduct the wedding. And because of the strange behavior of the groom, the wedding was canceled, which is a fairly unusual thing once a wedding was approved. He wrote a letter to me during this month that I was gone. It was single space, maybe 5 or 10 pages, that made all kinds of outrageous accusations and had demands, including that he wanted to know the premarital sexual behavior of all pastoral staff members, because he was going to indict everybody. And I actually read the letter and answered him, and I sent a letter back that said, dear person, your letter of such and such a date was received by me and read while away. Sincerely, Leith Anderson. And when I came back the next Sunday, first Sunday in August, he met me at the door and he was upset. He was outraged. And he said, I need to meet with you tomorrow. I'm not even sure I knew who he was. And I said, about what? He said, well, I sent you a letter and you didn't read it. And then I knew who he was. And I said, yeah, I did read it. I answered him. He said, you answer it with one sentence. And I said, well, that was actually what I had to say. And then he started yelling at me until a crowd developed out in the lobby area. And I mean, he's again laying all these accusations. There are churches that will allow that type of misbehavior. And he was, recruiting people in the church to take sides and everything. I don't often think I get direct ideas from God, but in this case I do. When he's yelling at me, I got him to pause for a second. And I said to him, how many churches have disciplined you for this kind of behavior? Pause. He said, well, only one has actually disciplined me. But the point here was he had done this kind of behavior in church after church. And aside from the upset, to love him and to be kind to him was not to allow him to do this or allow him to marry someone where he's going to do this within the marriage. And, so it was confronted. And in this case, I'm not sure what the long-term benefits were. But the point is, we taught a lesson to people who were out in the hallway. We are not going to accept this kind of behavior. It's not right. It's not right for that person.
Yeah, it's good. It's not loving him. It's not what you were about. That's great. That's a really good practical example. I appreciate you sharing that. Well, friends, as we wrap up our last 5 minutes here, one of the things that we like to do here as we have a special guest is go through all of our panelists, and Leith, will start with you, but we give you a final word on the topic. As you think longevity, as you think long-term stay in ministry, being in ministry for the long haul, just a final word that you would leave pastors and ministry leaders that are watching. We'll start with you, and then we'll go to Margaret and Eric.
Yeah, well, as far as the congregation is concerned, know them well, teach the Bible, love the people, celebrate God's blessings, and get help to deal with the challenges.
Thanks for that. Margaret.
Eddie and Leith, we've talked several times about the importance of having someone you can reach out to, that you're not alone in this. I was just thinking about, Leith, some things you've said is when we have this dip right now is, or for pastors who are kind of in that 5 to 7 year aspect or questioning their ministry, this is a real powerful time to think about how I want to show up, what adjustments I need to make. It's really easy to say, this is what I need from my church, but this is also a growing time about how do I want to run the race? We've talked a lot, you guys used the phrase jet fuel drinkers. That's not something that can a 30-year stretch. So how do I retool my sense of self so that I can be whatever I do for the long haul? Because even if you change vocation, you're still in something for a long haul and you're bringing yourself to it.
That's good.
So thinking about this time as a time of thinking about that fit and also my own character.
Strong. Eric.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is echoing Margaret, avoid isolation. Being a pastor is one of the loneliest jobs. It's not the only lonely job, but it's certainly one of the lonelier vocations out there. And so avoid the isolation. And one thing I love about Leith's story is just his passion for mentoring. He talked about early on in his ministry. He was mentored, and I would say have more than one mentor. Right? Those of us who grew up, those of you who are pastors, if your father was a pastor or your mother was a pastor, you obviously had that mentor. But a lot of us didn't stop there. We got other mentors as well, and I think that's important because sometimes your mentors are stressed as well, right? And so if you can't get a hold of one mentor, you can call another.
It's good. Friends, I think the only thing that I would add is just rest. Rest in your identity, who you are, who you belong to. You're a son and daughter of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and his righteousness defines you. His grace sustains you. You are not just a pastor. That is not who you are. You are first a son and daughter of the King. So friends, you don't have to hit a home run this Sunday. You have to faithfully teach the word, show up, love people well, and take the pressure off. That's really what we're all about here at the Backstage, is we want to just focus on our inner lives, the backstage of what it means to be a pastor and ministry leader, specifically in times like we live in 2021, where a lot of demands are placed on pastors and ministry leaders. But friends, we want to tell you that you are not alone, that we have resources and help available to you. Visit our website, resilientchurchleadership.com. You'll find books and articles referenced here today, a recording of this webinar and conversations along with our previous ones. Our friends at Pastor Serve, Jimmy Dodd, a dear friend and a regular guest here, he and his team are offering 2 actually full counseling sessions to you as a pastor and ministry leader. If you just need a check-in, if you just need a safe third space to bounce off something that you heard or something that you're wrestling through, I invite you to take advantage of that. And that can be found on our website as well, resilientchurchleadership.com. Just want to say thank you so much first to Pastor Leith Anderson for joining us here this afternoon. It was an honor and a privilege to have you. Thank you for just sharing your life and your wisdom with us. Margaret, Eric, as always, thank you. Friends, we will see you here next week, same time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time here at the Backstage, as we continue to invest in the health and wholeness of leaders, because we believe healthy leaders lead healthy churches, and healthy churches change the fabric of our cities. We'll see you next week. Thank you, guys.